In our series of webinars on grant making trends. I'm just going to start with a brief introduction to who we are at KIDA and who our guest speakers are today, and then we'll hand over and we'll get started. So my name's Alex Blake. I'm the founder and director of KIDA Consulting. We help charities to secure funding and to tackle strategic challenges or opportunities. I'm not going to go into any detail. If you'd like to find out a bit more about our services, you can check out our website. It's got our services, our training programs, and a couple of different types of free resources, articles, events like this one, and our trust fundraising scorecard, which I'll just tell you about briefly. So that's a self-assessment tool. It's completely free and confidential. Should take less than 10 minutes to complete, answer a series of questions, and then that gives you a score in 5 areas of trust fundraising, and gives recommendations on where you could make improvements. The reason I mention it specifically, as well as being helpful for you individually, we're currently analysing the data from that. So we've had 270 charities have completed that over the last kind of 9 months or so. So we're looking through the data. I'm also doing some informal interviews with fundraisers and a few people from funders and in the sector. And then we're going to be pulling that together into a report that we can share with you. If you've opted into our emails, you'll get a copy of that report around early July. And then 2 quick things I wanted to mention. One is our training around evaluation for fundraisers, a practical guide to how evaluation frameworks and tools work, how you can then demonstrate your impact and effectiveness, help to articulate that when you're speaking to funders, when you're making applications. That's being delivered by my colleague Nikki Roma through 2 Zoom sessions on the 1st and 8th of June. And we've got 2 places left on that. So if you're interested, there's some more information on the website, and there's just those couple of places left for that in a couple of weeks' time. And the other thing I wanted to mention is an initiative from IVAR, Institute of Voluntary Action Research. I've mentioned a few times before because they're always doing great stuff. They're leading an uncertainty initiative, which is a 90-minute drop-in peer support sessions that they're doing for groups of 10 charity leaders every week, starting up again from June on Zoom. So it's a safe space to share challenges, time to pause and reflect, and an opportunity to hear from each other's experiences of adapting to and leading in this prolonged uncertainty. They're also going to be offering ways that you can influence funder practice through those sessions, because they're also running their open and trusting grant making initiative, which a good number of funders have signed up to. So they're currently building their understanding of the situation in the sector, and then calling for funders to respond in terms of their grant making practices. So you can find out more about the work they're doing with funders on ivar.org.uk/flexiblefunders. And if you go on the homepage, you'll see there's a link there for booking onto the sessions. So that's for charity leaders particularly. So I know we've got a number of chief execs and leaders of small charities on the call today. So that might be something that you guys want to check out. Yep, coming back to today's webinar. So we're looking at the question of what next in terms of the UK's grant funded landscape. So this is something that I've been asked a lot, talking to people, particularly in the context of having had all the COVID emergency funding programs last year, looking at what's going to happen this year. Is there as much funding available? You know, are grant makers going to be responding differently? What sort of situation are they in? So we've got 3 great speakers today that are going to be exploring that topic with us. So I'll just briefly tell you a little bit about who they are. So we're going to hear from Max Rutherford, first of all, Head of Policy at Association of Charitable Foundations, or ACF, where he provides insight, intelligence, and enables collaboration between ACF members. And I'm sure Max will tell you the membership. I can't remember the numbers, but I think they've got certainly the majority of the larger funders with staff teams will be members of ACF. And I think they've got a good cross-section of some smaller funders as well. And Max has previously led the Transition to Adulthood Alliance at Barrow Cadbury Trust. He's a trustee at an operating charity and sits on committees at the charity SORP and definitely the European Foundations Network. So brings a really good kind of insight from different perspectives, and will share some insights from ACF's research and work with their members recently. We've also got Sufina Ahmad, who's director at John Ellerman Foundation, who's responsible there for all aspects of the foundation strategy, governance and grant making, and has previously been at National Lottery Community Fund, City Bridge Trust, and in service delivery and business development roles within charities as well, and also holds trustee roles, including at ACF, and is an honorary fellow of the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, having chaired their expert panel on equality, diversity and inclusion. And our third speaker is Faiza Khan, who is Engagement and Insight Director at the National Lottery Community Fund, which means that she leads the fund's activities around communications, engagement, knowledge and learning. And she was previously Director of Policy and Comms at Paul Hamlin Foundation, has led National Citizen Engagement at NHS England, and has been Deputy Chief Executive at National Council for Voluntary Youth Services. So again, brings a really interesting range of insight, and you know, the kind of biggest community funder in the country can tell us about what they're doing there. Sufina and Faiza have both been awarded MBEs for their work in the sector as well. So we've got the Royal Seal of Approval on our speaker lineup today. And also, interestingly, both started their current roles in January 2020. So had a good month or so to get settled in and get to grips with their roles before the pandemic hit, and had to deal with all of that stuff as well. Someone's just commenting that the voice to text captioning is hilarious. So I'm assuming it's not proven to be very accurate. I was just going to come on to some of the stuff around Zoom. I'll do that in a second. So we're going to hear from each speaker about 15 minutes or so each, and then we'll have time afterwards for Q&A and discussion for a good half an hour or so. So to post a question, we're using the webinar rather than Zoom webinar rather than Zoom meetings for the first time. So rather than popping it in the chat, if you can use the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen on the toolbar there, post any questions you have. And then what you can do as well is you can upvote. So if you click the like icon on the question, that gives it a vote. So the questions with the most votes will be the ones that kind of go to the top of the list, and we'll deal with those first. So that should mean that the ones that are relevant to most of you will be the ones that we cover. But also use the chat function for general thoughts, comments, any relevant links you want to share, and you know, anything else you want to share your experiences as opposed to questions. We're recording the event, so if you do have to miss any of it or you have to leave early, we'll share that later in the week. Someone mentioned about the text caption, so you can turn the subtitles on or off. Yeah, I'm not sure about the accuracy. I think sometimes they work better than others. So there's a live transcripts button on the toolbar, which is where you can toggle that around. And I think that's all the kind of housekeeping and tech stuff. Once I hand over to Max, I'll keep an eye on the chat. So if there's anything not working as it should be, let me know and I'll try and deal with that. So yeah, I think that's everything. I can't offer you a cup of coffee. Don't know where your toilets are. I'm guessing you're probably not expecting a fire alarm to go off. So if it does, please do go and check that your house isn't on fire. But apart from that, I think we're ready to get started. So I'm going to hand over to Max to talk us through ACF's recent work. And I will work out how to share your screen. And ask you to unmute, because that'll be helpful.
Thanks so much, Alex, and good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be participating in this session today. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes or so. I've got a very small number of slides just to move things along, which I'll just share now, and we'll get going. So I wanted just to start the session today, as we're talking about foundation sector trends, to ask the question, who do we mean by foundations? It's something that I think we tend to take a bit for granted who we're talking about when we say foundations. And there is a pretty broad consensus as to who we mean when we talk about that part of civil society. But the UK, unlike most other parts of the world, doesn't define what a foundation is in either its laws or regulation. Nearly all charitable foundations in the UK are registered charities with one of the 3 charity regulators. Around half have family-led boards using an endowment from a settlor. A fifth are connected to a company that provides its income, while others are fundraising from the public, from other foundations, or from government, including community foundations or broadcast appeal charities. And of course, among the most significant charitable foundations, often included in that category, are lottery distributors. Some, like city livery companies, actually predate the Magna Carta. They're more than 1,000 years old, while others were set up just a few weeks ago. In total, around £6 billion is distributed by these funding organisations each year. They work across a kaleidoscope of causes and have hugely different operating models and budgets. So we have the Wellcome Trust at one end of the spectrum, which holds a quarter of the charity sector's assets in its £28 billion endowment, and is responsible for around a third of all annual grant making in the UK. Whereas there are many thousands of foundations that have no staff at all and give less than £100,000 each year. Some are activist campaigners and service providers. Others work behind the scenes, funding capital projects or direct hardship grants to individuals. In the last year, many targeted their funding in response to COVID. Some have been at the forefront of finding a vaccine, including the Wellcome Trust, while others provided core funding for mental health charities or to help keep food banks up and running. Many stuck with the causes they've always supported, from international aid to prison reform to choral music. So you can see why making generalizations about funders or foundations is tricky and inevitably will fail to reflect the full ecosystem of that part of civil society. That being said, it is useful to explore trends that are emerging. And as the membership body for UK trusts and foundations, we're privileged to support more than 400 grant-making charities who between them represent about 80% of the UK's annual grant making. About half of our members are very small, but we do have in membership nearly all of the largest foundations. So today I want to share some trends we've identified in 3 main areas: COVID, climate, and diversity. In March, we asked our members to tell us how they responded to COVID and what their plans are for the year ahead. The data was clear that foundations are seeking to rise to the challenge in response to the increased demand caused by coronavirus. 9 out of 10 expect to maintain or increase grant funding for civil society in 2021, even though 40% are expecting a negative impact on their own finances. Hopefully that main headline finding gives a degree of reassurance to many of you. Many plan to maintain or return to their usual funding programs this year, but apply a coronavirus lens to their work and offer additional support to groups that have been most affected. More than 8 out of 10 stated an ongoing commitment to the welcome increased flexibility for grantees and reduced administrative burden for applicants, and we very much hope that that will be a feature of practice that's here to stay. 2/3 said they'd work differently in 2021 to normal because of the ongoing impact of the pandemic, with nearly half planning to do this throughout the year and the other half saying they thought it would in fact extend beyond 2021. So overall, the data suggests a strong commitment from foundations to civil society in the year ahead. But the turbulence around income, particularly for the largest funders, many of which are fundraising to an extent, will result in some difficult decisions. Foundation money is also likely to be more competed for than ever. It represents only half of 1% of government spending, So ultimately, civil society will be impacted far more by the wider economic context than by the actions of the foundation sector. There is likely to be less money available through usual fundraising routes, so the demand on foundations is likely to rise. This unfortunately means that even if foundations spend more, and many will, they will also be required to say no more often. But grant making isn't the only way that foundations are looking to make a difference with their money. They are increasingly exploring how to make more use of their endowments, not just as a means to produce an income for grant making, but to achieve public good itself. The major driver for this new impetus on investment is climate change. The climate emergency has not diminished with the arrival of the pandemic. If anything, it's been made worse given the political and economic focus in the last year on the health emergency. We now have less time to slow the irreparable damage being caused to the planet. While some foundations are active in the environmental sector, most are not. ACF's position is clear. Climate is an essential area of work for all foundations to take action on, and a lens to apply across everything they do, from programs to operations to investments. The sentiment that I know organisations like Akivo have also suggested is applicable to charities as a whole. The current Charity Commission consultation, which is open till Thursday this week on charity investments, is a significant opportunity to encourage more charities to be proactive in using their substantial assets for good, not just for financial return. We believe foundations should be proactive and intentional in investing their money in ways that not only avoid harm to the planet and communities, but actively do good. With £70 billion available to invest by foundations, they could be leading the way in responsible and ethical investment. So we're pleased that more than 60 foundations have now signed the funder commitment on climate change, but there's a long way to go before this is mainstream. That's why we've called in our response for the Charity Commission to be far more encouraging of charities to deploy their investments responsibly, really to make it an expectation rather than something as an addition. We want foundations to be ahead of the curve and on the right side of history. This is also applicable to how foundations act in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The last year has shone a bright spotlight on inequality and highlighted the foundation sector's lack of diversity, particularly at board level in terms of ethnicity and age, but also in some cases, the historic connections of philanthropy to colonialism and the slave trade. Several members of ACF have recently announced plans to initiate a programme of reparation to address the harm caused by their founders through their businesses more than 100 years ago. We know from the data we've gathered through our Stronger Foundations self-assessment tool that many more are taking active steps to implement aspects of DEI within their funding and operations, including increasing board diversity, devolving decision-making to communities, and ring-fencing funding for communities that have been racially minoritized. A small number have made a public commitment to be anti-racist, and many more are seeking to take action in the year ahead. ACF itself is on this journey, and our Stronger Foundations programme set a high bar for our members with the pillars of stronger practice 18 months ago. Our recent coordination of a letter to the Prime Minister, unusually signed by 60 members to object to the presentation of findings in the Sewell report, is an example of our more public action. So to sum up, this is, as we all know, a time of flux and enormous challenge, and foundations are not immune from this. But the heightened demand for their support means it's more vital than ever that foundations use their assets in ways that are ambitious and effective in pursuing social good. We're encouraged by how many foundations are responding at pace to some of society's most pressing challenges, and the signs are that more will follow in the year ahead. For now, thank you for listening. I'll pass back to Alex.
Thanks, Max. That was really interesting, and definitely interesting, I think, for the fundraisers among us to just have it highlighted that actually dealing with our grant applications and our inquiries aren't the only things that grant makers are thinking about and kind of working on. There's lots of other kind of big meaty issues there, like looking at their investments, looking at diversity, equity and inclusion in their decision making and their governance and everything. Really useful to get that insight. I'm going to actually, I'll just remind everyone just to pop your questions on the Q&A. Got a couple of good ones there already. But as people are speaking, if stuff comes to you, then just pop it in there, particularly as we're doing the upvoting. So you're getting more kind of people to click it and more chance for getting responded to if you put it on there early rather than waiting until everyone's finished. But apart from that, I'm just going to hand over next to Sufina, and I will, I don't need to do anything. Let me know if I need to help you share screen or anything.
No, I'm just speaking, Alex, so I hope that's all right with everyone. Hopefully my closed captions will reflect what I'm actually saying. First of all, just thank you for the invite to join you all today. I'm really delighted to be here. The reflections I'm going to share today are primarily based on my experience of working at John Ellerman Foundation. And for those that don't know us, we are a medium-sized grant maker and we support UK registered charities delivering nationally significant work in the arts, social action and environment in the UK and the UK's overseas territories. My reflections are quite high level, I guess. I'm reflecting on what I've been seeing and learning this last year. Some of it is very much based on practice that we put in place at John Ellerman Foundation. You can always find out more about what we're doing either through our Twitter account, which is @EllermanUK, or using the updates from the team section of our website, which is under our About Us section, because we blog on a monthly basis on things that are of interest to us. So I'll pepper this with some kind of very personal reflections of running John Ellerman Foundation, and then some more high-level reflections on what this period has meant for the grant-making sector and what might come next post-COVID-19. So I want to start by saying that I'm a massive advocate and champion for the many positives that underpin the concept of philanthropy and charity. I do believe that philanthropy has been at the forefront of creating and embedding significant and much needed positive societal, economic and environmental change, and that can't be ignored. But I do think that we have to think carefully about how we move forward from the worst aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in so doing, we have to acknowledge that we do need to shed some of the worst aspects of philanthropy, such as the power imbalance between the funder and those that they fund, the lack of transparency often within grant-making processes, and the inequitable distribution of funding, resulting in racially minoritized groups and those with lived experience receiving less funding. I agree very much with Max that in discussions like these, it's easy to generalize and talk about philanthropy as if it's one homogenous sector, and it isn't. And of course, there are philanthropists and philanthropic organizations that are at different stages of our various journeys and towards being better grant makers. And there are clearly those who are already delivering exceptional work. So my comments do primarily relate to the independent grant making sector and very much reflect perhaps what Max was describing in terms of the ACF membership. So all that out of the way. So what do I think comes next for funders and grant makers in terms of our grant making practice specifically? So there's two things I thought I'd share today. First of all is how will we as funders really embed the brilliant practices that have been applied in response to the COVID-19 emergency? And secondly, I wanted to share some brief reflections on leadership within the sector and how that can be applied in order to tackle some of these almost intractable issues that we now face as a society, such as the climate and biodiversity crises. So to the first point, has the pandemic enhanced our grant making practice? So in a word, yes. I think I'll give you a bit of a longer answer than that. So I think the funder response to COVID-19, which I think is best epitomised by the We Stand With the Sector pledge, which was coordinated by London funders and has been signed by literally hundreds of funders, has taught us an awful lot. It's for me, I think it's really re-energized the art of the possible. So the pledge, for those that haven't come across it, called for funders to prioritise and offer flexibility, adaptability and support to applicants and those that they fund. And that's been delivered in a whole range of ways. So some people have launched emergency funds, others converted project funding to unrestricted funding. Some people did away with reporting. Some people released more funds than they had planned to. Others have removed the breaks. Often we ask for a break between a grant ending and someone reapplying, and many more ways in which the sector responded and innovated in response to the emergency. I at one point did wonder whether in our haste to respond, we might end up embedding some of our worst practices, because take, for example, the fact that we know that there's been an underfunding of racially minoritized groups. If we are just kind of further funding those groups that are already within our portfolio, did we therefore risk as a grant making sector only supporting those that were already on our books, as it were? I think in many ways my concerns have been unwarranted. I think there have been positive changes on the approach that the grant making sector is taking towards diversity, equity and inclusion, and more specifically anti-racism. That's of course been catalysed by the murder of George Floyd, the fact that COVID-19 has a disproportionate impact on Black and minoritized communities, and we are blessed to have those working towards racial justice, including the Black Lives Matter movement, supporting civil society and the grant making sector to be better. So for me, I think in the last year, we have seen funders engage with the issue of race and racism in a more meaningful way than they have ever done before, and that's to be very much welcomed. So kind of combining, you know, what the We Stand With the Sector pledge called us to do as funders with this kind of greater focus and more meaningful focus on race and racism, I think the London community response, which was coordinated by London funders, perhaps epitomises some of the positives that we must now hold on to and take with us into our future. So that response has done something that probably a lot of us on this call didn't believe was possible. You know, you had over 60 funders distributing over 50 million, coming together, using a common application form and embedding things like diversity, equity and inclusion so effectively that they've been able to distribute grants at pace and in a way that is representative of the demographics and the needs of London. So coming back to this idea that the pandemic has made us maybe rethink what the art of the possible is, let's use that kind of creativity and innovation as we move forward. And there are of course other initiatives that I want to kind of shout out as being led by and for Black and minoritized ethnic groups that again have dismantled some of these stereotypes or reimagined the art of the possible and resulted in funding being distributed in a way that is equitable and meaningful and effective. So the two that I would just mention are resourcing racial justice, which I should flag that John Ellerman Foundation provided core funding towards, and also the Baobab Foundation. And these really are initiatives unlike anything we've previously seen in the sector, and we must do all that we can to ensure that they remain centred in our practice. So the response of funders to COVID-19, coupled with the leadership of some of the groups I've mentioned already, do give me hope. They give me hope that as we move forward from the pandemic, the funding community will continue to operate with greater transparency and trust, and that we will continue to centre and empower people that have experienced marginalisation and that have lived experience, and therefore are experts in the issues and causes that we care about. You know, we should be seeing that experience as being an asset and something that we want to invest in and support, All of this work, though, does require long-term and sustained efforts. Just because we've been doing it for the last 9 to 12 months doesn't mean that, you know, we're all good now. It is more than just a hashtag. It is more than just writing a blog. It is about us as funders ceding our power and our privilege and recognising the power and expertise of the people and communities, such as those on this call today, who live and breathe the causes that we care about. So it is only when we truly embrace the notion that applying an equity and justice lens to our work is more than a nice to have or a tick box exercise, and recognise it as something that's essential, that I think we will be excellent grant makers. And I'm sure, you know, from the conversations I'm having both internally and with peers, this isn't an opportunity that we're going to let pass us by. And we're very fortunate that we do have membership bodies like ACF who will keep us in check and kind of call us to return to these things if we start to stray. And then we've also got, you know, movements forming within our sector, like Grant Advisor, who's currently running a campaign called Fix the Form, which is advocating for greater transparency on application processes. Alex mentioned IVAR and its work on open and trusting grant making. And we do have things like 10 Years Time, which is working on making the sector more accessible to and inclusive of people with lived experience and from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. So I do feel confident that we've got, you know, formal infrastructure like our membership bodies, and then other infrastructure that will keep us in check as we progress on this journey to really centre and empower the people who are closest to the issues and cede some of our own power and privilege. So in the final few minutes, I just want to talk briefly about leadership within the sector. So obviously the last year has taught us to really embrace, maybe is the word, foster, I don't know, embrace kind of the need to manage within disequilibrium and to accept the need to adapt, and that we need to generate leadership not just in ourselves, perhaps those with titled leadership positions, but in our peers and in our team and the wider sector. So I think there is something about embracing the need to operate within the paradoxes of leadership. So, you know, leaders are often talked about as needing to act consistently, but then show adaptability too. And so this does mean that we need to become perhaps less linear in our thinking and feel more comfortable in holding kind of diametrically opposed ideas at once, and trying to use those to generate new ideas that perhaps are superior to those ideas in the first place. I think we need to get much more comfortable in embracing multiple working hypotheses, and I think we need to get better at delivering a vision from multiple standpoints. It might even mean not committing to grand and detailed strategic plans. It could be about running numerous experiments and giving ourselves a framework through which we can be innovative and creative and test and create ideas. I hope that approach might lead to us tackling the immediate and current challenges more effectively than perhaps we have done so previously. And just, I guess there's 4 things that I think we need to do as a sector and in terms of leadership that I hope will support us as we continue to tackle things like the climate and biodiversity crises, anti-globalism, racism, and many other systemic and structural barriers that a lot of you will be dealing with in your own organisations in relation to different inequalities. So the 4 capabilities that I hope that we'll invest in as we emerge from this crisis are as follows. So the first is sense making. I think we do need to understand the context in which an organisation and its people are operating, and we need to map out the situations that we find ourselves in and do so from a place of real humility and with a real commitment to learning. This is always going to be a continuous process. The map will only emerge from melding our observations, our data, our experiences, our conversations, our analysis. And it will mean that we need to continually improve and test principles as well, whilst we might apply this framework or we might explore that one, but really challenge ourselves to maybe move outside of the existing frameworks and norms. The second aspect that I hope we invest in around leadership is relating. So of course, this is about building relationships within and across our organizations, but they need to be trusting relationships. We need to be more inquisitive, we need to be more connected, and we need to try to understand other people's perspectives with a more open mind and with less judgment, and try to create safe and brave spaces in which people feel that they can share their ideas without fear of, being ridiculed or ignored or whatever else it might be. The third element is around visioning. So how do we create a compelling picture of the future? We are faced with a huge amount of what are essentially crises and paradoxes and difficulties. So how do we imagine something that supports us to move with confidence towards greatness? And then the final one is inventing. So how are we going to develop new ways to achieve the vision and give it life and give it meaning? Clearly as funders within this sector, there's lots of talk about power and privilege, as there should be, because we have plenty of both. I've been thinking a lot recently about the idea of quiet leadership. So how, as quiet leaders, we can exercise judgment effectively. And when I think back over the last year, it's clear that quiet leadership has had its place in supporting some of the change and progress that we have so desperately needed. Often quiet leaders are the people who might be overlooked for a myriad of reasons. They might not have a fancy job title, they might not be the best funded, they might be smaller, they might be within a niche subsector. There's all sorts of reasons why quiet leaders might get overlooked. Perhaps they've got visible or invisible labels that mean that they are othered. But I find time and again that it's the quiet leaders that have the skills, the capacities, the resources that we need. They've got the ability to sense make, to relate, to vision, to invent. And so they're often the people who are doing the hard work and the necessary kind of background work through which, we can form these building blocks that we need to dismantle the oppression or the injustices that we currently find ourselves facing. So I guess if I was to kind of bring this to a close, my hope is that in time we'll talk more about grant makers and their role perhaps as quiet leaders that are committed to truly championing civil society to address the myriad of opportunities and challenges we currently face. And the only way that we'll do that and become more of a quiet leader is if we kind of take on board so much of what Max has already shared in terms of using the entirety of our assets to level at these kind of challenges and opportunities we currently face. Thank you.
Thanks, Sufina. That was really interesting also, and really great to hear the kind of really quite progressive and ambitious ideas that you've got there. I really like those kind of 4 points that you ended on, and I think certainly not just more funders, but more of us in the sector and in life in general took on some of those ideas, that would definitely be a positive thing. We're getting lots of good questions coming through, so thank you to everyone for posting those and to people voting. So we should get the most relevant ones to cover later on. I just made a note of a few of the things you mentioned there, Sufina, in terms of some of those different initiatives, resourcing racial justice, Bay Above Foundation, Grant Advisor, 10 years time. I will share links to those when we do a follow-up email later in the week. I'll just send the links to the home pages of the website so people can check it out. But if there's anything more specific, then just drop that through to me and I can share that. Also, if there's anything you want to share in terms of those 4 points, if there's anything kind of written up on your website or anything like that, then please do send that through and we can share that with people as well. But I will now pass this over to Faiza, who can talk us through the next bit as well. I'll just mute myself.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thanks Max and Sufina for lining up such great presentations for me to follow. I was asked to speak about the immediate response from the National Lottery Community Fund, and then talk a little about where we might be going next. So I wanted to start with an overview picture of the fund for those that aren't familiar with us. We're the largest grant maker in Western Europe, I think, by one, so very big. Our focus is on communities. We, in terms of the total awards committed in the last financial year, the total value of new awards was around 700 million, which included around 233 million of third-party funding. By that I mean government and other sources of funding that we were distributing at the same time as national lottery funds. To give you an idea of scale, and this isn't about ego, but it speaks to why it's so important for a funder of a large size to connect to its communities and to work with its stakeholders. So I'm kind of giving you this picture, not to kind of stamp the size of the organisation, but to demonstrate the scale and therefore the duty involved in being such a large funder. From 2004, we've had around 200,000 grants valued at around 9 billion. So if you take it back from then to now, that's the scale of the investment out to communities, a large degree of which has been possible thanks to national lottery funding from players up and down the country. And to give you an idea again of the picture in any year, it's around 600 million we give out on average. 12,000 grants are made on average a year. And of those, around 70% are under £10,000. So 2/3 of our grant making will be for the very, very small grassroots, small community organisations, hyper-local and responsive in terms of what people are asking for. Of course, we also take some big bets and have strategic priorities like the climate and other areas that have been discussed today, where we'll make a significant investment over time with our funding. So that's a kind of broad brush picture in terms of the scale of the funding, and you can find out more about kind of our corporate objectives attached to all of that on our website. But I wanted to give you a bit of a insider view to those early days of the pandemic and what we've learned and how we might be responding to some of the challenges that others have shared here already. So immediately you can imagine taking an organisation of 800 plus and moving that juggernaut to everybody's kitchen table. So it was a bit of a task. So we did that early, probably, I think we did it a couple of days ahead of the formal lockdown. And then at the same time, and there was a lot of things that were happening, we very quickly turned our mind to our own approach. And it bore absolutely the hallmarks of the London community response. And I also want to thank those colleagues there for convening such a large number of funders at scale and at speed. So what's interesting about that is, you know, the ability to work at scale by joining together with others was seen there. And then you had the National Lottery also doing its bit. And I think there's something about how we work as an ecosystem of funders that we could learn from that example. But essentially, a lot of the principles, whilst we don't sign things generally as an NDPB. So a lot of the things you've talked about, we care dearly about, but we don't necessarily sign up to those things because of our NDPB status. Nonetheless, our immediate response was to act fast, to get cash out to communities fast. We made a public pledge to do that. We talked to grantees up and down the country. So immediately, I know portfolio directors that were leading funding in their countries were on the phone to their grant holders. We invested in sense making through our UK portfolio, who led a number of conversations with organisations to understand what the experience was like and shared that on our website. And we formulated a set of principles about how we would fund immediately, that we would vary grants if necessary, that we would give people the, drop some of the bureaucracy and the reporting requirements that might be usual, that we would be there to help organisations pivot to online service delivery if that's what they needed, and to plug gaps in funding in terms of equipment they might need to do those things. So very much an emergency response and a message of assurance that I think was much needed from us as a funder, like many funders, whether it was through signing the pledges from London community funders to acting out those principles. In our case, we popped ours on the website and said to people, be rest assured, we'll be there with you. We're going to honour all of our commitments and we will be there to do more if needed. at that time as well, I think I just want to also, you know, I said to Alex before this, I'm messaging not money in terms of being the engagement and insight director. And what that really means in practice is I've got also one eye on the campaigns and the PR and the communication, not just for the National Lottery Community Fund, but for the National Lottery brand. And it was clear to me within weeks, as early as 2 weeks, since the crisis hit, that the closing down of retailers and the very different the buying behaviour that we were seeing for National Lottery tickets could make our revenue somewhat vulnerable. In fact, it was pretty dicey in the early days. And it's worth remembering that National Lottery sales contribute 30 million a week to good causes. So the reason I mention that is that the activity to plan campaigning alongside other distributors was a really big part of our early response, as well as our kind of the funding guys doing their bit to get cash out. So those two things, if I was to say there were three things we were watching in those early days, it was the remote working, making sure we could pay out, do the assessments, work as an organisation at scale, ensure our principles for funding were clear to people who needed us, and also keep an eye on the revenue from which we are able to fund, i.e. the ticket sales, and work with distributors to, you know, think about how the public understand a good cause share from the ticket sales that we enjoy. So that all of that was going on, and actually I think we had excellent feedback from grant holders up and down the country, really appreciating appreciating the messages of assurance and flexibility more than anything. And this goes back to, I think, some of the great things we've learned about how funders have acted during the pandemic. It was interesting because if I'm honest, some of the messages of assurance and flexibility we gave, I don't think are not there in a usual year, but the act of going out and actively saying so, actively giving permissions to vary your approach or your grant, saying it's okay, I think really mattered to people at that time. And so I just observed that, because some of the things we did, we would have done anyway. But there's something for us as funders to think about how we deliver the messages of all the tools that we have in a usual environment, and whether or not the crisis taught us the importance of sharing that permission and the flexibility a bit more openly. Come March, we prioritised we took a bit more focus around our emergency response. So we said that we would prioritise 3 groups: people experiencing disproportionate challenge and difficulty, that we would prioritise services for vulnerable people in particular, because we saw there was increased demand following some of the conversations that we'd had, and also that we felt it was important to keep funding going to organisations that have a role in connecting communities. Infrastructure with a small I, perhaps, not trying to keep the oil going between communities. But I say with a small I because some of it was quite kind of big infrastructure, you know, the usual infrastructure services you might think, but actually some of it was the conduit piece, you know, the connecting one charity to another, helping people respond to a local need. And I think that connectivity between organisations and people up and down the country was a real credit to communities, and we're humbled to have played a small part in helping that continue. And I'll go on to some of the things we're doing to help us learn from how the positive aspects of that, where it was happening. So, I mean, just to give you, an insight, in the first 6 weeks, there was 120 million out of National Lottery funding to around 4,500 organisations. So that was the speed of the operation. But of course, coming out, and it continued at that pace, really. But just stepping back, whilst we were doing the funding, as I said, we were doing quite a lot of grant holder conversations in every nation of the UK. We were listening to our peers. Lloyds Bank Foundation, for example, have a great set of data around the value of small, and I would welcome, you know, if you're working in some of the smaller organisations and even some of the larger, there's a lot to be learned from their work. And we kicked off something at the end of the year called the Community Research Index, which really helped us. Again, this wasn't to grant holders, this was to 7,000 members of the public, to ask them whether or not some of the services they'd seen in community in 2020 was reflective of the things they felt were important for them as residents of those communities. And what was heartening is that a number of a high degree of the responses really mirrored some of the activity that was going out into communities through National Lottery funding. So that was, we've not done that before. It was an opportunity for us to hold a mirror to our funding and to say, well, are we actually funding things that matter to communities? We think we are, and we do a whole host of other analyses. But actually this was to non-grant holders, and that was something we'd not done before, and in part to check how things were feeling out there in communities. And so we're lucky in terms of trying to, I think what I really valued was the ability for the funding to do its bit, and then for some of that kind of grant, I hate the term funder plus, because I think that actually all funders should be doing learning, listening, grant making, sharing, and that's not funder plus, that should be part of funding. But if I say funder plus, people might grasp that what I mean is everything beyond the grant to kind of offer those other sense making and listening services as part of your offer to your communities. And as we were doing all that, we were learning how differential the picture was for communities up and down the country, and how important that hyperlocal response was. And you can see some of the voices and the experiences that we've captured in our Voices from the Pandemic series. It's on the Insight tab if you go to National Lottery Community Fund's website, and you'll be able to canter through experiences from communities from, you know, day one of the crisis right the way through to the anniversary of the lockdown, which perhaps might be a useful resource for colleagues looking to share practice. Where are we now? We're learning from all of that, learning from our peers, good foundations and trusts that have also adopted different ways of working, thinking about how that's gone, thinking about how our own response has gone, learning from each country in the UK, because actually there are nuances in country that really work for that particular country, and regions in England that need a certain approach, and the differential nature of our approach up and down the UK is something I really want to hold on to. It's so important that we don't take a one-size-fits-all approach to this. I think we're lucky to have boots on the ground across the country, and we've certainly been trying to listen to their experiences of working with grant holders, and we'll continue to do that. So we're on a kind of, like many, thinking about renewal, rebuild. What does it mean for us in this new normal world where we may have to live with a pandemic, but also want to come out stronger, fairer, greener, that we want to espouse the best of ourselves that we saw in the pandemic. And as Sufina said, maybe shake off some of those long-standing characteristics that as a funding industry may be so deeply embedded that they are actually causing unintended barriers for some communities. What that means for us is, as I said, we're an NDPB, and you'll be familiar with the government's levelling up agenda, and I was reflecting that actually, whilst it's looming large in public discourse, it isn't any different to, in a lot of ways, the way the lottery has operated for some time. We do look at deprivation levels before we fund. We do look at geographies and need. We have had environment in our articles for a very, very long time. And over, I think, the 26 years of the lottery, we have funded over 300 million towards the environment. Many of you will know we have a £100 million climate action fund at the moment. So I suppose what I'd say is, for us, the focus is on how can we pivot our resources to be responsive to the emergent challenges for the nation. Internally, we've been talking about youth, mental health, employment, under the banner of levelling up, perhaps, but actually, you know, those things that we've invested in for some time, how are they going to be part of our thinking going forward? And I think for me, as an engagement and insight director, one of the things I'd reflect is, I think we've got to work harder at being clearer about the value we can add in these pieces. We're at being such a large funder, we can be quite difficult to understand in terms of what we're prioritising, and that's something I think we should try and address, so that it's easier for people to recognise the value we add in these high priority areas as we all hopefully rebuild to a better future. And then going back to the role of a funder beyond the grant making, I think the coordination effort that we've seen up and down the country, whether it's been collaborations of funders on particular themes, crisis response, I think that working across a number of stakeholders and the coordination piece is something I hope we will hold on to and learn from. I do think people worked in partnership before. It's not as though it hadn't happened, but there was a very different feel where the rulebook got ripped up and you were able to do other things. Maximising networks, I talked about the hyperlocal. I think that's something I'd really want to think about going forward, the networks of networks that could make things happen at scale, that bear the hallmarks of civil society of old, that get up and do and respond and react attitude that we see in so many volunteers. And I think we saw it at scale in a way that other industries probably struggle to activate. And I think I just want to learn from some of that. Honest conversations I've got down here about what matters. And I think, again, with the rule book being ripped up, it really felt like, I mean, you know, you commented that Sufina and I joined in January 2020, and whilst it was challenging to join the fund in only a matter of weeks, I hadn't met a huge number of people that work in my own directorate, let alone the fund. Actually, the ability to just sort of go, what matters right now, and almost not be held to some of the norms and politics or considerations that usually are at play, and really respond together. That was elating, and I think that's something, again, I'd want to hold on to. And then I've got joining up of data. So one of the things I've observed over the course of 2020, and one of the things the National Lottery Community Fund is doing in earnest, is thinking about our resource and value, that our value that we can add from the data that we have as a resource, I should say. So what can we, again, going back to knowledge and learning, what can we glean from a database at scale, given our size, as I started out with? Actually, what can that tell us about trends and challenges going forward, and how can we use that more purposefully? I do have a number of examples of grants that have been working at the coalface, if you like, here, and in some ways I was going to shout them out to you, but I'm conscious of time, Alex, and do want to leave colleagues a chance to ask questions, so I won't. But needless to say, the examples I've got here of organisations are those that have been working in their communities, rooted with their beneficiaries for some time, and pivoted their services to really meet need. And that is, for me, one of the most humbling examples when I see that over 2020, how people have just adapted. And I want to finish with 2 points: stability and innovation. So I think those the case studies I've got here signal the importance of those charities being there in our social fabric, able to provide stability even at a time of crisis. And I think that's something that we should hold on to, and at the same time make room for innovation. So for me, stability can be as radical as innovation. So I hear a lot of the shiny and the new going on in some of the rebuild conversations. And I guess I want to make a plug for how important it is to hold on to stability for those communities that are well served by organisations, and also experiment and test and innovate. And perhaps we have the privilege to do both. I think it's important to do both as you're thinking about your future priorities. And I guess that's probably what I'd finish on in terms of the 2 things that I hope we'll think about as an ecosystem of funders retaining, making sure great things continue to happen, but also that we give a chance for the new to flourish as we try and work out how we can be better. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Faiza. That was great. Yeah, great points out. I just made a note of Lloyd's value of small. Can share that, and then in terms of your community research index, if you've got a link to stuff around that, that'd be cool to share with people as well, because it's probably something not so many people picked up on. Yeah, really interesting points again, and yeah, I think we've probably all seen lots of those really positive examples of good work happening in communities, and that mix of stability and innovation, and innovation always being a bit of, not always, often a bugbear of kind of charity leaders and fundraisers when funders use the term innovation, and think, actually we need to carry on doing the services we're doing. And also there being different interpretations of innovation. So I think you can innovate by adapting your services iteratively in response to understanding the community's needs really well, which I know is what the fund's all about and what we should all be doing. And that's a form of innovation, not just the kind of big new shiny idea or the piece of tech or whatever it might be. But I'm not going to chat on because I know people have posted loads of really good questions. So I'm going to be completely democratic and just go from the most voted downwards. So congratulations, Claire, you've got the most votes with your questions. We're going to tackle that one first. During 2020, many grant makers focused on supporting charities they already had an established relationship with. Do you see evidence of this continuing? And if so, where a charity doesn't have any or many of these established relationships, do you have any insights how they can break in and begin that sort of relationship? So it'd be great to get insights from any or all of you, obviously from perspective of your own funders, Sufina and Faiza, or broader views on speaking to other funders as well. Do you think that's something that people are continuing to do, or is there a shift, and how can people begin those relationships from a standing start?
I'm happy to jump in first, if that's helpful.
Yep.
So, I mean, John Ellerman Foundation, we stayed open, and so we made new grants, and we've assessed that 50% of the grants we made, no one had were made to organisations that hadn't had a previous relationship with us, and then the other 50% included people who had unsuccessfully applied previously, as well as those that had successfully applied. So obviously, if we can be, we're going to be including that statistic in our annual report, and clearly I think there is a job that funders need to do about being quite transparent about the level of turnover in their grants portfolio. And certainly from our perspective, we weren't unique as a grant maker in staying open. There were quite a few medium-sized and smaller grant makers that stayed open to new applications. Of course, there were those that had to close for very kind of understandable reasons too. So I guess I think those that maybe closed to applications will start to re-emerge and reopen now, because we're starting to reopen offices and perhaps more established in this kind of hybrid or remote way of working too. In terms of how you kind of break in or start a relationship, I think that it is about looking at what advice the grant maker is putting out there. So on our website and in conversations like these, we're very clear that we are open to inquiries, and people, if they need pre-application support, seeking that either over email or over the phone or video or in person when that's possible. We're very kind of open about our funding guidelines, and they are the funding guidelines that we use internally as well. So there's no kind of secret version where we go, oh, they didn't figure out that what we really meant was this. So if you feel that you're a good fit with the funding guidelines, you can also look on 360 Giving and our own website at our grants list, because that in itself gives you a sense of what we're interested in funding, where our board is, because they're the ones who take the decisions. So I think with all of that, I don't think we're unique as a funder. I think there are other medium-sized grant makers and larger ones and smaller ones who are doing the same. I'm sure there aren't enough of us doing that, and I'm sure there's more things that John Ellerman Foundation could be doing in order to make it easier to start a relationship with us. But I would say as a responsive grant maker, we are very open to people contacting us and reviewing the information we have on our website and using that as a guide through which they can say, oh, I think we're a good fit, we'd like to have a conversation, or just go ahead and apply.
Thanks, Sufina. And Faiza, you've got your hand raised.
I mean, I think it's really interesting to reflect on organisations, many of whom a lot of funders did pull the drawbridge up, and had to for good reason. And then there were, as Sufina said, others who kept open. I mean, just to give you an idea, around in terms of new grantees, about 60% of the funding we did last year went to new grantees. So and that's average for us, actually. I mean, it was about 57% the year before. So it's in line with the previous year, and we kept open, and, you know, we're able to fund a number of organisations. For me, there's two bits to this. One of them is about one of the points I want to make is about ecosystem. As funders, I think we need to get better at collaborating and understanding who is doing what in which areas, and therefore trying to signpost people where we can. So if we have to decline somebody, saying, well, actually, you're not maybe a great fit for us, but you might go elsewhere. And I think there is a bit of that we might want to bring in to the assessment. But I know people do it already, and I think that's a really valuable exercise in terms of that ecosystem and coordinating with each other. I think in terms of how do you break in, all the things Sufina said absolutely apply to, you know, a lot of funders are on 360. I think looking at your fit, absolutely. We have an advice line that you can call and start to have conversations. If I tell you some of the things that I think are obvious that I see people doing, at times we get approaches where it's not clear where the project is, and in that first approach it's really useful to maybe say, for us, for example, and it may not be true of smaller funders, we'll have bespoke teams that work in regions. So we'll have a London team and we'll have a Midlands team, and actually it's quite useful for you to connect to whoever is your local grant making team if you're applying to the community fund, to get that sense of advice. If you're national, of course, that's fine. We also have national programs, but just starting to locate yourself as to where you might be in the funding portfolio that we offer, I think is a really good start. And I can't, I mean, I won't repeat everything Sufina said. All of that is really, really good advice. I hope that helps in terms of the breaking in question for those of you that are new applicants to funders.
Right, thanks guys. So next question is, with competition higher than it's ever been, and the focus for almost all organisations being on the stewardship of current funders through the inverted commas magical phone call, how do we stand out from the crowd over the phone when we're fully aware that we're just one of tens, if not hundreds, of other organisations making those same phone calls? So what can people do to really stand out when they're making those initial phone calls? So I imagine that's about. Any thoughts? I appreciate it's a bit of a tricky question, and it's, I suppose it's partly a question of how do we appeal to funders, but I suppose it's specifically about those kind of phone conversations rather than when you've got the opportunity to make a full case in writing.
I'll offer a few views, not just from Lottery, but from Paul Hamlin as well, and what I felt worked well. So I think to appreciate funders, you know, always have to say no more than they can say yes, and clearly that's in the question. I find people who had cut through and do cut through are those that really are laser focused on their ability to meet the kind of the principles of the program you're applying for, but doing it in a succinct way that, you know, I've seen people do pitch documents, for example, before phone calls. I always think that's a really good idea, to kind of send something along that in a really brief summary highlights some of the things you might want to talk about. That doesn't have to be, you know, a piece of artwork. You can do it very quickly ahead of a conversation. It just allows the funder to think ahead in terms of what you might be saying. I think cold calls are very difficult to start to engage people. So that'd just be one little tip that I've seen work, where people don't say any more than they're about to on the phone, but they give somebody, maybe if you have the chance to send something in before you have a phone call, that might be a good idea when people are busy and then they have a sense of what you might want to talk about. I think being upfront and honest about your challenges, as difficult as that can be, is a really good way of engendering trust, but also helping a funder understand how they can meet your needs. And I think also being able to ask whether or not you've kind of hit the mark for a funder. Don't feel shy to say, actually, are there things that I've left out? Do you understand kind of where I'm going? Is there more homework I need to do? Those would be some of the things when I've seen people connecting, and I keep my beady eye on the grant holder conversations, those sort of things seem to cut through.
Can I just really briefly add, I completely echo what Faiza said. I think as well, people do cut through when it's clear that you kind of are aware of what the grant maker stands for. So from John Ellerman Foundation, we're kind of at the other end of the scale of National Lottery Community Fund. We have a team of 3 full-time people working on grants, and then me for part of my time. And so phone calls are always, you know, very welcome. We recognise it's much more inclusive than just having to do everything over email in an impersonal way. And so, you know, we're comfortable with having to deal with the spectrum of someone who kind of completely doesn't know us but wants to get to know us, and those that are more prepared. I think it's just about you get out of the phone calls what you put in. And so that would be my kind of view on it. I think we do sometimes get cold calls where it just feels like someone is just powering through a list and that we're on their list and they're ticking us off. And it does always help if there's a little bit of familiarity with us, you know, and obviously that's a bit of an ego thing maybe I'm sharing there, but I do think it helps to, you know, come into it with a kind of inquisitive, slight awareness of us as well. But very much echo what Faiza mentioned already.
Yeah, thanks guys. I think if I can just share a couple of quick thoughts reflecting on those responses. I think it's interesting that both of your responses weren't like, oh, you should tell us about this thing or this thing. Definitely interesting, Faiza, you mentioned about asking some of those questions. And I think, and Sufina saying about, you know, what you put into the call is what you get out. I think, you know, asking questions to learn more about what the funder's looking for and what they need to hear from you is really crucial. And then just a point, kind of reflecting back to you guys, I suppose, about how you might perceive some of those incoming calls. Like Sufina mentioned, sometimes it feels like someone's, you know, bashing through this like sales script at high speed because they're doing lots of phone calls. Actually, often, like the majority of fundraisers making those calls, it's like the most terrifying part of their role that they put off and procrastinate. And then when they do it, they're like, oh shit, this is really important. I've got to get absolutely perfect. I'm going to blow the chance of my charity getting some money out of this funder. So, you know, sometimes it's all that kind of stuff going on there as well. So, and often people will have kind of written out, oh, I need to tell them this, and this, and then nervously kind of go through it as well. So it's, yeah, it's bear with people if they're kind of coming across in a way that you think, oh, what are they going, what are they doing? Right, next question we've got is on reserves. So with the pandemic having such a huge impact on reserve levels, is there any indication funders will be less inclined now to penalise organisations with high levels of reserves, which of course have offered increased resilience to the ongoing impact on finances? If not, could there be better facilities to explain why there are these high reserve levels, which perhaps is a point around when there are kind of application forms having an opportunity to explain things in the accounts. So yeah, question there about less penalising high reserves, and it's an interesting question and topic, I think, in terms of any sort of differences in terms of opinions on where reserves levels ought to be and how you would kind of factor that into decision making.
Yeah, I'm happy to offer something on that, Alex. There's a great article which I'll put in the chat from a few days ago from Karen Bradshaw at Charity Finance Group, who, like me, is on the SORP committee looking at the rules for charity accountancy practice. And she talks about the need now to rethink the rainy day myths of charity reserves. This whole attitude and approach to charity reserves needs a rethink, and not least among those considering awarding funding to other charities. Foundations should be right up there really in thinking strategically about reserves, because those with endowments have between 20 and 30 years worth of running costs in reserve. And foundations need, like any charity, to be able to justify that. They clearly have a rationale for why they hold so much money in reserve, because it's an endowment that's invested to produce an income, which is the budget for operations and grant making. But now is not just a rainy day, it's a downpour, a torrential downpour, and a lot of our members are thinking and reviewing whether they should indeed operate in perpetuity, as they've done for some cases hundreds of years, or whether they should start to spend at a faster rate. So that's on the foundation side. I think why that's relevant, that conversation about strategic use of reserves, it's important for how funders think about reserves in those they fund. And reserves are a tool, and the reserves policy should be seen also as a tool. It should be approached with intention and in alignment with the charity's mission and strategy, and the SORP gives advice to charities on how they might present that rationale and that intention in their accounts and in their documents. So I think funders, like with many things, like with safeguarding, other kinds of financial due diligence that they might be conducting, they should be taking an individualized, proportionate, strategic approach to how they think about the reserves of those that they are receiving applications from and funding. I think it doesn't really make any sense, to me anyway, for funders to have blanket fixed levels of reserves above or below which they will or won't fund in any given charity. If the last year has taught us anything about reserves, it's that they should be thought about in a strategic sense, and I think it is time to remove those arbitrary thresholds around funding or not based on reserve levels.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I always think it's odd that we use that measure of number of months running costs as a, I know why we do it, because it simplifies things, and we tend to want to simplify complex issues so that we can make sense of them. But it's so much more complex than that in terms of what your income sources are as to what the risk is of there being a significant drop in them in any given year or not, and how you need to respond to that. Next question is another good one. Is there an indication that grant makers will look at longer funding terms? It's an ongoing concern within the charity sector that short-term grants hinder innovation, development, and staff stability / succession planning.
I'm happy just to make a brief comment on that. When I was at a foundation previously to my current role, this question was often posed, and in fact the trustees often asked the question, why were they seeing so many applicants being brought forward by the staff team for 2-year funding? There seemed to be neither one thing or the other. It wasn't a sort of short-term project-based intervention. It wasn't longer-term funding. They would say, why 2 years? And the answer from a staff member's point of view was that it was making the best of a difficult choice. On the one hand, we knew that short-term 1-year grants were rarely particularly effective or impactful unless they were something very targeted. It would always be better to, in almost all cases, to fund in the longer term. But in our particular case at the foundation I was at, long-term grants, multi-year grants, all had to be funded from within that year's budget. The reason for that was we were steered by the board not to forward commit budgets into future years, forward commit grants into future years' budgets, because then next year and the year after that, you'd have less available to be responsive to the needs of the time in the future. So the grants team has a choice. Do you fund 3 grants at 1 year each, or 1 grant for 3 years? Because all the money has to be found from that year's budget. So the reality for the vast majority of funders is that dilemma of, do you try and respond to the largest number, at least to some extent, or a smaller proportion over a longer time frame? It seems like in the last year, more funders have opted to fund short-term support interventions to try and reach a larger volume of very high need, rather than, as they might prefer and might in normal times have done, to fund a relatively smaller number of organisations over a longer term.
Thanks, Max. I'll move on so we can try and get through another couple of questions or so in the last 10 minutes. Next question, whilst I appreciate that funders have never received high levels of applications and are therefore unable to always let applicants know they've been unsuccessful, do the panel agree that more funders could offer, at the very least, a semi-automated communication to all applicants who are not successful? It's just painful hanging on to that hope that your email may have just been lost in the ether even after months of waiting.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think you should be empowered to follow up if you haven't heard anything back and to request feedback if that isn't forthcoming. But I think certainly with the Stronger Foundations work, it's quite clear that there is, our membership body ACF is telling us to be much more transparent in terms of how we provide feedback and how we communicate our application processes. So I'd hope that things will improve over time, but whilst they aren't where they need to be, then yeah, do seek clarification.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that and agree completely with Sufina. I don't think it's as good as it should be. I remember looking into one grant program that we had at my last foundation, and I just remember realizing that 400 people had applied for this one kind of panel, right? So it's kind of like when you put in for something, it's useful to know what you're up against. I often thought that actually if you just got something back saying thanks for your application, you're one of 400, we'll get back to you. I'm not saying that that's what it is right for everyone. And maybe in time we will get to a place where that becomes more of the normal kind of automated, letting you know where you are in the journey and where you might be going next. And certainly some funders manage to do it better than others. I think it's something we all need to look at. And I think actually just really reinforcing what you just said, Sufina, that let's be empowered to call up and ask, because you're entitled to. Find out where you are, as things can take some months sometimes before I know funders are able to get back.
We've got a question here. Are grant-making trusts sufficiently resourced? So many seem, even prior to COVID, to have insufficient staff to properly assess and review applications. I was told by one trust that they give 30 seconds to each application. Does the sector feel that more investment should be put into this resource, as otherwise it seems very disrespectful to applicants and indeed rather short-sighted? And I suppose you could ask that about some of the kind of proactive initiatives as well around looking at diversity and climate change and so on. So more resource from grant makers being spent actually on their own capacity rather than on grants. To kind of give that better service.
Gosh, I've never heard a statistic like that. That is incredibly short, and I think there's always the kind of, obviously we want to make sure as much of our funding goes out in grants and not for our kind of operating costs, and there's a balance to be struck. Certainly I can say that a lot of the previous organisations and where I currently work, we don't spend 30 seconds. I know funders do use things like eligibility checks, which kind of make sure that you meet their basic criteria. So for us, we have turnover restrictions. You have to be a UK registered charity only. And so that will kind of, funnel people quite swiftly. And we use our kind of online database to support with that. But no, I think it's a real shame if that's what's happening. I worked at 3 grant makers and haven't come across that kind of practice. But clearly where that is happening, then I think you're absolutely right to call for more resource being invested into that organisation. But, if that's kind of digital resource as well as physical people, then yeah, I'd be supportive of that. But 30 seconds is by no means enough time. And I don't think it's an example of good or promising practice.
It seems in that instance that there's either the wrong operating model for that charity, that grant making charity, as in not enough staff to deliver a good service, or they have too broad criteria and are being clear enough with applicants in order to narrow the application field to meet the operational costs that their board has allowed. but something in that instance should be adjusted at one end or the other or both. That ultimately all these funding organisations, with few exceptions, are charities, and they have boards of trustees who have to make informed strategic choices about their operating model, and that there are all kinds of different models even within ACF's membership. There's some of our members who have no staff at all. Some have teams of several hundred staff, like at the Wellcome Trust, but there's a rationale, there should be a clear rationale behind each of those choices. And my previous organisation, Barrow Cadbury, had a very, compared to most funders, a very high spend on internal operating costs, because it did a huge amount of research and advocacy work in-house, was more of an activist funding charity rather than a more traditional grant maker. But that was set out and rationalised and explained and open to challenge at any time. So I think, again, it comes back to being very intentional with how a funder uses its resource and remaining open to reviewing that regularly.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, I think that's probably the case. We've got 3 minutes left. Let's see if we can get a quick response in to this next one. So, is there a danger as more funders work closely together that it will actually exclude organisations, particularly smaller community organisations, i.e. many funders continuing funds for existing grantees and funders sharing information, so they all end up supporting the same organisations? Would anyone like to pick up on that one quickly? Maybe just one response to that one.
I mean, I don't mind going in. I hope that doesn't happen. My comments about working as an ecosystem are precisely to try and spread the finite resource, however big. I mean, I've given you some big numbers, but whatever we've got, whatever other funders have got, is not enough to meet the need. We know the need is acute. So my comments about ecosystem and working together and coordinating are primarily to think about how we can all stretch further with what we have. And I think that's as much about not just who we fund as an individual grantee, but also the choices we make about the strategic areas we're going to prioritise, you know, and talking to each other more and, you know, saying, well, actually, we think we're going to put X amount into this area. You might have been thinking the same, but if we've got it covered, is there another area that's left left behind? And I think that is what I would hope for. I think we saw much positive collaboration during COVID, where people were thinking like that, you know, who's specialist. We did a fair bit of delegated funding at the lottery and also used other funders to reach people at speed. So I hope it's more of that ilk than people trying to fund the same organisation because they feel self-assured because, you know, Ellerman did, and so they've got an endorsement, so somebody else will too. I hope it's more mature and sophisticated than that.
Thanks, Faiza. We're down to the last minute, so that's going to be all the questions we've got time for. Apologies if we didn't get down to yours, but I think there were some good questions in there and some really interesting responses. So I think that's really added to what people have really said. So just finally to thank the speakers, thank our panel, Sufina, Faiza, Max. Fantastic contributions, really interesting, insightful, and in many ways inspiring stuff. And you know, thank you for your time and your contribution and everything that you're doing for the sector. And thank you to all our attendees as well for coming, joining us, giving your precious time and posting really good questions. So thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a good day, good week, and we'll share the recording and links later on in the week. Thanks all. Bye bye.